Thank you, Colleen. So just a little bit more about who we are as an organization. We're the National Advocates for People with Down Syndrome since 1979. We're a resource center for children and adults with Down syndrome, for parents, professionals, self-advocates, and other interested individuals. And we at NDSS envision a world in which all people with Down syndrome have the opportunity to enhance their quality of life, realize their life aspirations, and become valued members of welcoming communities. And we really believe that a lot of this starts with being included in schools. So today's topic, we are in Inclusion 101 webinar series for educators, and we're presented by the National Down Syndrome Society's Inclusive Education Task Force, which just launched this past May. So today's presenters, you have myself, Sarah Jo, who's the NDSS Tayshoff Inclusive Education Fellow, and I manage our task force, and we're so lucky to have Fred today. Fred, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Fred. I'm the President and CEO of the New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education. We provide support to schools to include students with disabilities, and we provide support to parents when they need consultation about IEPs and inclusion. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So I just wanted to start off with what is inclusion. And I always start these with my favorite quote from Dr. Julie Costin, who in many of the realms of inclusion is really the queen of inclusion. And she says, inclusion is a way of thinking, a way of being, and a way of making decisions about helping everyone belong. So at a fundamental core, that is what inclusion is. The goal is to be fully included as a full community member into the general education classroom.
Inclusion is about being accepted. It's not just about being there. It's not just about being in a class, but it's about being accepted as a valued member of that class. It doesn't mean sitting in the back in the room with an aide, but it means being a participant in all of the activities in the class, sitting with all of the other students. And it's about true access to the general education curriculum as well. It's about being there. It's about having friends. It's about belonging.
But what does the research say? This is a question I get asked all the time. I hear educators and administrators across the country say, well, you know, we think it's great they can make friends, but academically, you know, what does the research say? And we have many years, almost 40 years now of research that says students make more progress in reading and math when they're included in general education classrooms. We've seen increases in standard test scores were related to increased time spent in general education classrooms. Researchers have noted students with disabilities can more easily access the curriculum in inclusive classrooms when these practices and strategies are implemented. When inclusive strategies are implemented and students are really full members of their classroom community, this is when we see better academic results versus being in a secluded, segregated setting.
The basis for inclusion in local community schools starts with the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And the Act states that to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are not disabled. And special classes, separate schooling, or other removal from the regular education environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in the regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Implementing IDEA means that the local school and regular education classroom the student would attend if not disabled is the first placement option considered for each disabled student before a more restrictive placement is considered. IDEA says that students should be exposed and included in the general education classroom first before making any other decisions.
So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act also says a student with a disability is not removed from education in age-appropriate regular classrooms solely because of the needed modifications in the general education curriculum. This means that students do not have to be performing on grade level. They do not have to, that is not a barrier that they need to achieve before they're able to be in the general education classroom. That is not a basis by any which we are measuring students under IDEA.
So after IDEA was passed, there were a number of challenges to the inclusion aspect of IDEA. In one such case, O'Berty versus the Board of Education, which is a civil rights case that was eventually appealed to and decided by the U.S. District Court covering the state of New Jersey. And the case focuses on the placement and education of Raphael O'Berty, who at the time was a young child with Down syndrome. Even before kindergarten, officials in Raphael's district recommended placing him in a segregated classroom in a different district over an hour away from his home. After initial objections, Raphael's parents reached a compromise with the school, allowing them to provide limited amounts of inclusion at the local school. But unfortunately, without adequate supports, the efforts to include Raphael did not go well, and the district again recommended a segregated placement outside the district. The O'Bertys objected again, filed a due process hearing, and after disagreements back and forth, the O'Bertys brought their case to court as a civil rights violation. At the first hearing, the administrative law judge cited the district. They appealed again to the U.S. District Court, and the trial was held in 1992, hearing evidence from leading special education experts. The court sided with the O'Bertys and their experts, finding the district had not demonstrated that Raphael could not be included in a regular classroom if necessary aids and services were provided, and the court decided that the school district had violated the IDEA law. Basically, what the court found was that a child should not have to earn his way into an integrated setting, into an inclusive setting, by first functioning successfully in a segregated setting. What the district was saying at that point was that Raphael had not proven his readiness for a general education classroom in the self-contained classroom. And that's not what the law says. And the judge found that inclusion is a right, not a privilege for a select few. Success in special schools or special classes does not lead to successful functioning in an integrated society, which is clearly one of the goals for IDEA and the basis for inclusive education.
So under IDEA, there are some rights guaranteed to students who have disabilities, and one of those is the least restrictive environment, often referred to as LRE. So the LRE says every student categorized as having a disability has a legal right to instruction in the least restrictive environment, meaning to the maximum extent alongside general education peers. And that, of course, comes with the modifications and adaptations that we were talking about earlier.
The other law that governs education is the idea of FAPE, or free and appropriate public education. Under IDEA, every student with an IEP must be provided an education that meets the individual needs of the child to gain access to the general education curriculum at no cost or zero cost to the family. It's about inclusion and progress in the general education curriculum that is the focus of much of these laws.
Mm-hmm. So what might an inclusive classroom look like? There are many different models, and many different models are successful. So we're going to sort of paint a broad brush here. But first, collaborative instruction. And with collaborative instruction, that may be between co-teachers who, two teachers, one classroom. That may be between general educator, special educator, who maybe is not in the classroom full-time, between aides or paraprofessionals, and also between therapists who either push in for supports and services or maybe don't get to push in as much. But collaborative instruction and collaborative planning is really fundamental to having an inclusive classroom so that everyone is on the same page, so that everyone is able to make sure that we're working towards the goals for the individual students. You may also see augmentative communication devices and adaptive equipment, and you may see differentiated lesson plans as well.
So how does inclusion work? Well, there are a number of models involved on a school-wide basis, but inclusive classrooms approach instruction using the UDL framework implement positive behavior supports, offer differentiated instruction and/or modification to the curriculum, assessments, physical space, etc. And an inclusive classroom requires collaboration between teachers, support staff, and therapists. Part of how we help students to be successful is by providing accommodations and modifications. Accommodations are supports given to help the student meet the whole class objective of a lesson. It can be a change of environment, curriculum format, or resources that allow us for a student to gain access to content and/or complete assigned tasks. Accommodations do not adjust what is being taught. Examples of accommodations include sign language interpreters, computer text-to-speech, extended time on tests and assignments, large print books, trackballs, alternative keyboards. There's a large number of potential accommodations that can be provided to students with disabilities to help them gain access to the content.
So we also have talked about modifications. And while an adaptation has no change to the objective, modifications are changing the work or objective. It's a change in part or all of the curriculum. This should still allow for as much access to the general education curriculum as possible. So some examples would be reduction in the number of spelling words or vocabulary words, a focus on one explorer in a social studies instead of all those during the age of discovery. That's actually a modification I use quite often when I teach social studies in the 5th grade curriculum. Simplification of numbers from whole numbers to whole numbers instead of decimals for math problems. So, maybe instead of 3-digit numbers, you're using 1-digit numbers, but you're still able to do the same processes as in the general ed curriculum, but with the change of the numbers so that students are able to access it. So we spoke a little bit earlier about UDL, and UDL is really vital to an inclusive classroom. So for those of you who have not heard of UDL or are a little fuzzy on it, UDL stands for Universal Design for Learning. So whenever I talk about this, I like to start with this comic, which you'll see all the time when people are talking about UDL. And so it's a winter scene, and there's, person shoveling off and a student in a wheelchair saying, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the person shoveling says, "All the other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." And so the person responds with, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." And so when we look at this, to us it may seem, well, duh, every student can use the ramp, but that student in the wheelchair cannot use the stairs. So
UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, is not a special education approach. It is not an approach just for kids with disabilities. Universal Design for Learning is good instruction. It originated in architecture around means of access, and it was brought into teaching philosophies, meaning that everyone has a way to access content and educational experiences, so all students can learn to their fullest potential. UDL provides the opportunities for all students to access, participate in, and progress in the general education curriculum by reducing barriers to instruction, by increasing engagement with the curriculum, and by offering multiple means of expression. So when we talk about the 3 main principles of UDL, we are talking about multiple means of representation of the material being presented. We're talking about multiple means of student expression, multiple means of engagement. So we offer multiple avenues into access to the material, offer the students multiple ways to produce or provide a product of what they know, and we focus our lesson planning on also engagement. We won't go any further into UDL because we're going to have a future webinar which will do a deeper dive into UDL, But again, it is not a special education approach. It is for general education teachers.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that really, as Fred said, will benefit all students. I know in my classroom right now, I teach 4th grade, that something as simple as flexible seating is a principle of UDL, that students can sit, they can sit on their desks, they can sit on the floor, they can stand, they can pace, they can sit on the exercise balls, whatever's going to help them to engage in my lesson. So it really is something that you can work into every single facet of your classroom. So now we have time for questions. There's a chat bar on the side, so I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to, type in any questions you have, and we will answer them. So I just got a question sent to my email, which is great too, that says, what do we do if we're an educator? And then it says grade level, but the administration is not behind us moving to an inclusive model. What are the next steps? So Fred, what would your advice be for an educator who wants to create an inclusive classroom, but maybe whose administrators are not quite on board yet?
It's interesting. I actually have to do that quite a lot because I do run into a lot of educators who are more inclusive than their administrators might want to be. One approach that I've taken in the past has been to provide them research on how inclusion impacts standardized testing and standardized test scores, because that seems to be a hot button issue for administrators across the country. How do you improve outcomes? And inclusion has a 30-year history in research of showing that improves all outcomes: social, emotional, academic, even standardized testing. It has proven to improve the quality of outcomes. So I would start with things that they can relate to, and then step back to how easy it actually is to do. Because inclusion, once you start doing it, it is easy, and it does improve the outcomes for all students.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Our next question says, I'm a special education teacher, and I would like to create an inclusive program, but I have some parents who are adamant that they want their student in a segregated setting. What should I do? So for this, this is a challenging one, right? As an educator, I can really empathize with this one. I think a lot of what Fred was saying as well, that show the research, show not only test scores, but how also inclusive education really leads to a independent life. And I think that's what we want all of our students, not just syndrome, but all of our students, is to have the most opportunities that they can have, and to have every door in the world open to them, and eventually to live on their own, hold a job, have a life better than what we had. And we really believe, not only with the research, but also anecdotally, that it is by inclusive education that we get a lot of this. And so maybe if would benefit them to reach out to an older student, or you to reach out to an older student who has been included, and maybe they can meet with them and talk about their experiences. I know a lot of parents worry about bullying, but I can say in my own classroom, this is something that really these students become lifelong friends. And really, I've seen bullying go down in my own school since we've been inclusive. Fred, do you have anything to add to that for an educator who may be working with some resistive parents?
Yeah, I would encourage you to ask the parents where they see their children after high school, to ask them what they want their children to be doing, where they want them to be, how independent they want them to be, and then, you know, step the conversation backwards to the classroom and say, well, by having your child surrounded only by students with disabilities, how is that preparing them for that independent life? Where, you know, when we look around at the train station, at the subway, at work, we live in a typical world. How does a segregated classroom prepare any student for life in a typical world? That usually tends to help parents to start to see the longer term, because often parents want to keep their kids in those small class settings for short-term reasons. I think he'll move further in reading if he stays here this year, or math, or whatever. But helping to readjust that view to say, long-term, we want our kids to be independent. We want them to be able to live in this typical world. And the best way to do that is with exposure to that typical world in a safe and supportive environment.
Great. Another question says, you mentioned earlier about not sitting with an aide. How does that work with having an aide in the classroom? And could you explain more about that? So when we were referring to that, also what happens in an inclusive classroom is that a student is assigned a one-to-one aide, which is great. But what we often find is that that aide becomes glued to the student, and it really ostracizes the student and inhibits the student from making meaningful connections. And really often inhibits a lot of the learning that can go on as well. What we like to do, have the paraprofessional or the aide, whatever you call it, really be there. We may be assigned one-to-one with that student, but really should be working with the whole class. To be seen just as another adult in the room. That student is able to engage in the classroom just as their typical peer. So we should never see, you know, the paraprofessional's desk right next to the student, them sitting right next to the student, unless there's a specific reason. But unfortunately, we end up seeing that more often than not, and this may require some additional training on the paraprofessional's part, just learning how to, you know, work with all the students. And it's great. In my classroom, we have 2 paraprofessionals who are amazing and work with every student, you know, the student who comes in late or the student absent. While I may be working with a small group of students, they may be working with another small group of students. So it really does benefit the whole class. And also socially really benefits that student. Fred, anything you would like to add on to
yeah, I would just completely agree with what you said. You know, I understand why the student might have an aide to begin with, in certain cases to deal with certain issues or additional support needs. But more often than not, when we go into schools, we see aides who are hovering, who are inhibiting social relationships, and are really can become more of a hindrance than a positive. So I would say I agree with you that the aide should be more of a classroom aide than a one-to-one aide for as frequently as possible.
Right. And I always like to use the gauge of, if this student did not have Down syndrome, would you be treating them the way you are? So would you be holding this 4th grader's hand? Would you be bringing them in special treats? Would you be, you know, doing all these things? Would you be telling them, you know, you're my best friend, which I hear a lot of aides saying? or paraprofessional saying. So always remember that first and foremost, you're there as a paraprofessional or an aide to help the student academically, and really all the students academically and also socially. And by you hovering or being, really glued to their side, that becomes a hindrance. So if there's going to give just 30 more seconds for any more questions to come in. And if you, later say, oh, I wish I would have asked that question, you can always email me at NDSS, and I will happily answer any questions. Or if you have a specific to your classroom question or to your caseload question, I'll be more than happy to answer them. So upcoming webinars, we'll have a monthly webinar series specifically for educators put on by our NDSS Inclusive Education Task Force, which has some amazing members such as Fred. So please follow our social media, sign up at ndss.org. And I want to thank our NDSS Inclusive Education Task Force for their continued hard work into NDSS. So please follow us on social media and email me if you have any questions. And thank you so much for attending tonight.
And Sarah, thank you for putting this together. Amazing work.
Thank you, Fred, for all the work you do.
Good night, guys.
Night.